paradise turned into a nightmare in mere minutes. Hainan Island, China's crown jewel of tropical tourism, where crystal-clear waters meet pristine beaches and millions flock each year for the ultimate getaway experience, became ground zero for one of nature's most terrifying displays of raw power. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not in this slice of heaven that locals proudly call China's Hawaii. But when Mother Nature decides to unleash her fury, no paradise is safe from her wrath. The morning started like any other in this tropical wonderland. Tourists strolled along sun-kissed beaches, vendors prepared fresh coconuts, and farmers tended to their lush fields of tropical fruits that make this island famous worldwide. The weather forecast showed nothing more than typical cloud cover, maybe some light showers. Nobody, absolutely nobody, could have predicted what was about to unfold. Within the span of just half an hour, this peaceful island would transform into a disaster zone that would shock the entire nation and leave experts scrambling to understand how such devastation could strike so suddenly. What happened next would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about extreme weather patterns in southern China. The images that emerged from this catastrophe would go viral across social media platforms, showing scenes so intense that many initially thought they were watching footage from a Hollywood disaster movie. But this was real, and the people of Hainan were about to experience firsthand why climate experts had been sounding alarm bells about the increasing intensity of weather events across Asia. The transformation began at exactly 2:47 post-meridian local time, when meteorologists noticed something unusual developing in the atmospheric data. What started as a routine afternoon cloud formation suddenly began exhibiting characteristics that defied normal weather patterns. Temperature readings showed dramatic drops within minutes, while wind speed measurements started climbing at rates that left weather stations struggling to keep up with the rapidly changing conditions. Residents later described the eerie calm that preceded the chaos. Children were playing in parks, elderly people were enjoying afternoon tea on their porches, and street vendors were setting up for the evening rush. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, but in a tropical climate like Hainan's, that wasn't particularly unusual. What was unusual was the sudden silence that fell over the island just minutes before all that fury broke loose. Local fisherman Zhang Wei, who had been working these waters for more than 3 decades, noticed the ocean behaving strangely. The normally rhythmic waves became erratic, and the color of the water shifted from its usual crystal blue to an ominous gray-green that he had never witnessed before. Seabirds, typically abundant around the coastal areas, had completely disappeared. Even the stray dogs that roamed the beaches seemed to sense something was wrong, gathering in groups and heading inland as if following some ancient instinctual warning system. The first sign of real trouble came when the wind started picking up with an intensity that caught everyone off guard. Palm trees that had withstood countless typhoons and tropical storms began swaying violently, their fronds whipping back and forth like flags in a hurricane. Street signs rattled, loose objects started flying through the air, and the temperature dropped a shocking 15 degrees Celsius in less than 10 minutes. This wasn't just weather changing, this was nature preparing for war. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared the residents of Hainan for what came next. The skies above them were about to open up and unleash a fury that would leave the island scarred for months to come. At 3:15 post-meridian, the first hailstone struck the ground with a sound like a gunshot. Then another, and another. Within seconds, what started as isolated impacts became a full-scale bombardment from the heavens above. These were not the tiny ice pellets that occasionally fall during mild storms. They were massive chunks of ice, some as large as golf balls, others reaching the size of tennis balls, plummeting from the sky at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The sound was absolutely terrifying. Residents described it as being trapped inside a giant drum while thousands of hammers pounded relentlessly from above. Car alarms shrieked throughout the city as windshields exploded under the relentless assault. The pristine beaches that just hours earlier had been filled with tourists now looked like a war zone, with umbrellas shredded, beach chairs destroyed, and the sand itself pockmarked with countless impact craters from the ice missiles. Farmer Lu Mingshan watched in horror as his entire livelihood was obliterated in a matter of minutes. His banana plantation, which had taken years to cultivate and represented his family's sole source of income, was being systematically destroyed by nature's fury. The large tropical leaves that had provided shade and protection for the developing fruit were shredded to ribbons. Papayas that had been nearly ready for harvest exploded on impact, their orange flesh mixing with the accumulating hail to create a surreal, colorful carpet of destruction. The greenhouse complexes that dotted the island's agricultural areas became death traps for the crops within. The supposedly protective glass and plastic structures proved utterly useless against the barrage. Panes shattered in rapid succession, creating a symphony of destruction that could be heard for miles. Cucumber vines, tomato plants, and delicate herbs that had been carefully tended by local farmers were pulverized beyond recognition. An entire season's worth of work vanished in the span of 15 minutes. Local resident Maria Santos, who had moved to Hainan from the Philippines for work, captured video footage on her phone that would later go viral across Chinese social media. The clips showed hailstones bouncing off concrete surfaces like rubber balls, some reaching heights of several feet after impact. Her car, a modest sedan she had saved for months to purchase, sustained more than 40 dents on its hood alone. The rear window spider-webbed but somehow managed to hold together, though she could barely see through the damaged glass. While the hail created chaos from above, the winds began their own campaign of terror across the island. What meteorologists later classified as typhoon-force gusts, reaching speeds of up to 130 miles per hour, turned everyday objects into deadly projectiles. Street signs that had stood firm for decades were ripped from their foundations and hurled through the air like giant metal frisbees. Roofing materials peeled away from buildings in massive sheets, exposing the structures beneath to the full fury of the storm. The electrical grid, which had been upgraded just 2 years prior to handle the island's growing tourism industry, began failing systematically. Power lines snapped under the combined assault of wind and hail, sending sparks cascading through the streets like deadly fireworks. Transformers exploded in brilliant flashes of blue and white light, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness even though it was still mid-afternoon. The emergency backup systems at the island's main hospital kicked in just as the building's windows began shattering from the pressure changes. Trees that had stood as silent sentinels for generations became weapons in nature's arsenal. Ancient banyan trees, some with trunks so thick it would take 6 people holding hands to encircle them, were uprooted and toppled across major roadways. The island's famous palm-lined boulevards turned into obstacle courses of fallen timber and scattered fronds. Emergency responders found themselves trapped in their stations, unable to venture out as debris flew horizontally through the air at lethal speeds. The Haikou International Airport, normally bustling with flights carrying tourists and business travelers, became a fortress under siege. All flight operations ceased as ground crews scrambled to secure aircraft and equipment. Several planes that could not be moved to hangars in time suffered significant damage from hail impacts, with dented fuselages and cracked windows. The control tower reported wind gusts so strong that the building itself swayed noticeably, forcing air traffic controllers to evacuate to lower floors. Communication towers throughout the island began failing one by one as the winds intensified. Cell phone service became sporadic, then non-existent in many areas, cutting off families from each other and preventing coordination of emergency response efforts. Social media posts from the early minutes of the storm showed people desperately trying to reach loved ones, their messages becoming increasingly frantic as the situation deteriorated. The last coherent video uploaded before the communication blackout showed a massive construction crane being toppled like a child's toy, crashing into a nearby apartment building. The transportation network that kept Hainan Island functioning collapsed within minutes of the storm's peak intensity. Buses that had been navigating their regular routes found themselves stranded as drivers pulled over, unable to see through windshields that were either completely shattered or so heavily damaged that visibility dropped to mere feet. The island's modern subway system, a source of pride for local officials, became a refuge for hundreds of people who fled underground to escape the bombardment above. Highway overpasses that had been engineered to withstand typhoons groaned under the assault of flying debris. Video footage captured by security cameras showed trucks being blown sideways across multiple lanes, their drivers fighting desperately to maintain control. One particularly shocking clip revealed a city bus being lifted completely off the ground by a sudden gust, rotating in midair before crashing back down and sliding sideways into a guardrail. Miraculously, the driver and 12 passengers inside survived with only minor injuries. Ferry services connecting Hainan to the mainland were suspended immediately as harbor authorities watched waves reach heights they had never witnessed outside of major typhoons. The choppy waters turned deadly as abandoned pleasure boats broke free from their moorings and collided with pier structures. Coast Guard vessels that attempted early rescue operations were forced to retreat as visibility plummeted to zero and radio communications failed across the region. Emergency response teams faced an impossible situation. Ambulances could not reach injured victims, fire trucks were blocked by fallen trees and power lines, and police vehicles found their communications equipment failing just when coordination was most critical. First responders described the experience as trying to fight a war while blindfolded and deaf. Captain Wang Lei of the Haikou Fire Department later recalled attempting to reach a reported building collapse, only to discover that 3 separate road closures made the location completely inaccessible. The island's hospitals activated their disaster protocols, but staff members who lived off-site could not reach their posts. Dr. Chen Mei, head of emergency medicine at Hainan Provincial Hospital, found herself performing triage in the hospital lobby as patients arrived with injuries ranging from deep lacerations caused by flying glass to severe head trauma from hail impacts. The backup generators kept critical equipment running, but the constant power fluctuations made every medical procedure more dangerous and complex than normal. As darkness fell, the storm reached its most terrifying phase. Lightning began illuminating the devastation in stark, horrifying detail. Each flash revealed a landscape that looked as though it had been bombed, with debris scattered everywhere and buildings stripped of their outer layers. The lightning was not the typical brief flickers of a normal thunderstorm but sustained, brilliant displays that turned night into day for seconds at a time, allowing people to see the full scope of destruction surrounding them. Thunder cracked across the island with such intensity that it triggered car alarms throughout neighborhoods where electricity had been restored. The sound waves were so powerful that they shattered already weakened windows and caused some older buildings to develop new structural cracks. Children huddled with their families in interior rooms, many crying not just from fear but from the physical pain the sound waves caused their ears. Power outages left approximately 800,000 residents in complete darkness. Families gathered in bathrooms and closets, the most interior spaces they could find, listening to the chaos outside while praying their homes would survive the night. Emergency candles and flashlights became precious commodities as people realized this was not going to be a brief interruption of normal life. Cell phone batteries became lifelines, with people rationing their usage to maintain some connection to the outside world. The Sanya Resort District, normally glittering with neon lights and bustling with nightlife, resembled a ghost town. Luxury hotels that charged premium rates for ocean views found those same windows becoming liability hazards as the storm surge pushed massive waves far inland. Hotel staff moved guests away from exterior rooms, cramming them into interior conference rooms and ballrooms that had been transformed into emergency shelters. Rescue operations became nearly impossible as the night wore on. Emergency workers described trying to navigate streets they had known for years but could no longer recognize because of the debris and flooding. GPS systems failed as cellular towers continued to collapse, forcing rescuers to rely on paper maps and local knowledge to find people in need. The few successful rescues that occurred happened only because brave volunteers risked their own lives to help neighbors and strangers. The psychological impact began to set in as residents realized this was not just a severe storm that would pass quickly. Social media posts from areas that still had sporadic internet access showed people documenting damage to their homes and businesses, their voices shaking as they recorded videos by candlelight. The economic implications started becoming clear as business owners surveyed destroyed shops and restaurants, knowing that rebuilding would take months or even years. Weather stations that remained operational recorded wind gusts that exceeded anything in the island's recorded history. The storm had transformed from an unusual weather event into a historic disaster that would be studied by meteorologists for decades to come. As midnight approached, the full scope of the catastrophe was still unknown, but one thing was certain: Hainan Island would never be the same. Dawn broke over an island that looked like it had been transported to another planet. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the dissipating storm clouds, residents emerged from their shelters to witness devastation that defied comprehension. Streets that had been clean and orderly just 24 hours earlier were now rivers of debris, with chunks of hail still piled several feet deep in drainage areas that could not handle the unprecedented volume. Cleanup crews from across southern China began mobilizing within hours, but their efforts were immediately hampered by the sheer scale of destruction. Roads that connected major cities were impassable, blocked by fallen trees, collapsed overpasses, and in some cases completely washed out by flash flooding. Heavy machinery had to be airlifted to remote areas because ground transportation simply was not feasible. The agricultural losses were staggering beyond anything economists had predicted. Preliminary assessments suggested that over 75% of the island's crop production for the entire year had been wiped out in a single afternoon. Banana plantations that had supplied fruit to mainland China and export markets looked like battlefields, with destroyed trees scattered across vast areas. Coconut palms that had survived decades of typhoons lay uprooted, their massive root systems creating crater-like holes in the earth. Emergency shelters were established in schools, government buildings, and any structures that had survived the storm relatively intact. Over 50,000 people found themselves temporarily homeless, not because their houses were completely destroyed, but because damage from hail and wind had made them uninhabitable. Families who had lived in the same homes for generations faced the reality of starting over from scratch. The tourism industry, which represents nearly 40% of Hainan's economy, faced an uncertain future. Luxury resorts that had marketed themselves as tropical paradises now looked like construction sites, with swimming pools filled with debris and beachfront properties stripped of their landscaping. Hotel chains began calculating losses that would likely reach into the billions of yuan, while tourist bookings for the upcoming peak season were cancelled en masse. Medical facilities worked around the clock treating storm-related injuries. Hospitals reported over 2,000 people seeking treatment for cuts from flying glass, blunt force trauma from hail impacts, and respiratory problems from debris-filled air. Emergency surgery teams worked in shifts, prioritizing the most severe cases while managing with backup power systems and limited supplies due to disrupted logistics networks. This catastrophe was not an isolated incident but part of a disturbing pattern that climate scientists had been warning about for years. Dr. Zhang Weihong, lead researcher at the Chinese Academy of Meteorological Sciences, held emergency briefings explaining how rising ocean temperatures in the South China Sea were creating conditions for more intense and unpredictable weather events. The warm waters that make Hainan a tropical paradise were also fueling atmospheric instability that could generate storms of unprecedented intensity. China's meteorological data from the past decade showed a clear trend toward more extreme weather events. Hailstorms that were once rare were becoming annual occurrences, and their intensity was increasing dramatically. The economic toll from weather-related disasters across China had already exceeded 300 billion yuan in just the first 3 quarters of the previous year, and experts warned that this trend would only accelerate as global temperatures continued rising.